This is an in-depth analysis of Kamikaze. It serves as a revision of the poem, but also a chance to look a little bit deeper and maybe at some of the higher end possibilities here, if you choose to use this poem, especially as the chosen secondary poem to compare to whatever you're given. Now let's start at the beginning. What it helps us to know, as always, I point out that contextual information is only useful if it really comes out of the poem and develops our understanding of it. Bolted on context is not important. But in order to understand it, we do need to know certain things about Kamikaze pilots and what they did. That planes were stripped of as much as possible, only had enough fuel to reach the ships as they needed to be packed with explosives. In other words, a one-way trip. So it says Kamikaze means divine wind. Tells you something about the intention behind it, according to society. However, many of these volunteers were actually apparently placed under tremendous peer pressure to sign up, possible retaliation against their families if they chose not to. So there could well be something we're commenting on here. And they were very unsuccessful. Only about 14-19% of attacks actually hit a ship. It says they didn't do anything to turn the tide of the war. Commonly believed, it says there, they only managed to sink 34 Navy ships, damage 368 and kill 4,900 sailors. That seems large numbers, but when you think of the number of pilots there, 4,000 pilots, that, you know, that's almost pilot per sailor. Certainly didn't do much overall. Okay, finally, cairns are a mound of stones, and we come up to those built as a memorial, often like a gravestone, particularly in the past. So let's revise what happened in the poem. So a woman retells the story of her father, a kamikaze pilot, who turned around halfway to completing his mission. Very, very important there, as we'll come to a number of times, that it's a woman retelling the story. She imagines what happened. That's made quite clear in the poem. According to her imagination, he looked down as he crossed the coast and saw fishing boats and shoals of fish under the surface. It brought back a memory of his brothers playing a game on the shore while they waited for their fisherman father to return with his catch. And then she reveals that when he returned, nobody ever spoke to him again and treated him like he didn't exist. Even his children, who acted normally to begin, learnt to ignore him. And finally, she concludes by wondering whether he thought he made the right decision, as this was like dying anyway. Now, we'll come back again to this repeatedly. I've just mentioned it. But what is vitally important, I think, when you read this poem, is to notice that this is a story retold, and it's made quite clear that this is something that she has invented, really, for herself. And we can know that for several reasons. First of all, we'll come to it in a minute, the phrase "she thought he must have." Okay, so therefore it clearly is imagination. And secondly, of course, when he returned, nobody ever spoke to him again, then how do they know what happened? Now, the reason that's important is because it can kind of change what the poem is about. That it's somebody retelling a story that they have, again, invented, that then focuses around the idea that when he returned because of a memory of his family. And that would obviously be a very attractive thing for a daughter to imagine as the reason why her father did something that has so disgraced him. So if we start, obviously, as always, with the title, there's popular images of kamikaze pilots, and particularly that one on the right is what can be slightly disturbing sometimes about this poem. Does it really play to stereotypes? Maybe, possibly. But anyway, the kamikaze action here could be seen as metaphorical as well as actual. Remember, we think of the word kamikaze as doing something incredibly stupid that will result in your own destruction or disadvantages to you or whatever. So as well as actually being a kamikaze pilot, is his action in turning back kamikaze in the same way because it's self-destructive? That's definitely worth considering, particularly when you bring in what the last line is. Okay, what the question in the last line. Okay, so if we start from there, let's start taking it stanza by stanza and look at some of the details and what's suggested. We begin in stanza 1 with a list. Okay? A list of things that he takes with him when he embarks at sunrise. Now, two of these, a samurai sword and a shaven head full of powerful incantations, could well be intended to show the influence of Japanese society. I mean, remember, he hasn't taken a samurai sword for practical reasons. I don't think a sword would be much help in any particular situation he could find himself in. But the fact it's a samurai sword links him to the samurai warriors of the past, and you can see, therefore, that idea of tradition that comes through. You know, there's a link going right back to these brave warriors that are so important to them. And then this idea of a shaven head full of powerful incantations also suggests he'd been given kind of phrases, chants, whatever, to get them on their way. Are we meant to be seeing this as tradition, or are we meant to be seeing this as brainwashing? Now, when we do know, of course, that the story is an invention of the daughter, then, is she then attempting to pass the blame and play off her father as a victim? She may well know that kamikaze pilots took these things with them, but she won't have known from her father. So to list these on again, are we right from the beginning seeing society as having more power than the father? If we take the next two stanzas, then what we go into is the beginning of her retelling what happened to him, okay, from her point of view. And these two stanzas deal very much with a kind of a picture of nature. The idea of him looking down and seeing nature, and nature having some kind of influence. The key in these two stanzas is that what's being said to us here leads into the memory that comes up afterwards. So what's being described here sparks the memory. Okay, that's the role it plays. So, of course, we must start with the fact that she thought it happened. He must have the revelation, its imagination. Now, the interesting thing here, though, I've pointed for, she thought, and he must have. Does it actually suggest she genuinely believes this? Or is it just a way to convince her children? Worth thinking about, because once you bring in that idea that it's her storytelling, it's kind of important, her motivation behind it and her real feelings. Now, when he sees, in her story, when he looks down, we're described, he sees a little fishing boat strung out like bunting on a green-blue translucent sea. Clearly a very idealised picture, okay? Looking down and seeing something like out of a little picture book. As I say, it's not even really particularly realistic in its details that are there. And the bunting simile seems to be almost like a celebration. Now, again, does that relate back to the reality of the story? Or is it just a sense of idealising life? Is she trying to basically project his view of things? If he's going out and he's reluctant to die, maybe he would look down and see things there beneath him. Bunting strung out, celebrating life, survival, whatever. And then this carries on further down when we get this description of the fish that he sees in the water. And we've got a few things here, like a huge flag, dark silver. This could be seen, therefore, as more of a warning to him. So as well as looking down and seeing the fishing boats like bunting, it's just this suggestion that then the fish, the description of them almost suggests that there is something they're doing to warn him, particularly this flag going in a figure of 8. I've thought about this many times, why it's going a figure of 8. People have mentioned the idea that that's an image of eternity or whatever. Yeah, maybe that fits in nicely. certainly I know in motor racing, this might be a stretch, a flag and a figure of 8 basically says stop, turn back, you know. So again, is there a sense of that? Is that why we've got the contradiction between the dark shoals that come to the surface and flash silver? Dark, danger, but warning? Maybe. It certainly creates an ambiguity in the image. Okay, are these fishes sinister? Are they precious? Or is this again the two sides of the situation that we're in? So that is what sparks off the memory. But from our perspective as readers, what message is coming across to us? The beauty of nature, a sinister level of nature under the surface, a warning, a celebration of life. It leads into this memory, this very precise memory of him and his brothers waiting on the side of the shore and playing this game. Now, when we look at the details of this, we're seeing straight away images of survival alongside images of death. Okay, so bringing their father's boat safe, survival in the face of quite difficult situations, a breaker turbulently inrushing, again potentially bringing danger, if not death, and then just that image of them building cairns. I mean, they're not doing it deliberately, but using that description almost feels like they're preparing for something deadly. So just like we were talking with the fish and the dark and the silver, is there something about what's under the surface and what's on the surface, or is it just two sides of things? Again, danger and safety balancing each other out. Now remember, this is the story of what's going on, so all of this then can be applied to what she is trying to bring across in the poem about the daughter's motivations, the daughter's feelings here as she's bringing it. The story then continues in stanza 5, one of the strange ones. First of all, we get this, yes, grandfather's boat, and although I haven't put it like this here, it's notable, it's in italics. The first thing that comes up in italics here, we'll come to that in a minute, sets it out as different to the rest around it. But what seems interesting, as well as him coming home safe, which obviously links directly to the idea of the pilot coming home safe, you know, he remembers how important it was that his father came home safe from a dangerous situation, and you know, therefore that would bring him back. And do notice, it's never said in the story why he turned back. It's just presented. He sees this beautiful natural picture. It brings back the memory. He remembers the idea of them waiting for his father to come home safe, and then it stops. So we're kind of left to work out what might have brought him back then at that point. But this is a strange detail that comes in. He comes home safe, but he comes home safe with awash with, in fact, so absolutely packed with these types of fish, shellfish, sea creatures: mackerel, crabs, prawns, whitebait and tuna. Now I think there are a million different interpretations you could come up with as to what's going on here. And you may just as much focus on the adjectives: cloud marked, black, feathery, loose silver, and then the dark prints, muscular, dangerous. That could tell you. But certainly one of the things to notice is that the fish are incredibly varied. Fish, sea fish, shellfish, incredibly varied. You know, whitebait are tiny, tuna's huge, mackerel is very common, crabs, you know, around on the surface, very hard crustaceans, prawns, very light and gentle crustaceans. Is this the idea? The variety is there? Maybe? The good and the bad? The grandfather brought back everything? I think what I'd do with that is I'd leave it to you to say, if you're going to look at it that way, how does that fit in with the interpretation of what we've seen so far? So then we go back to those descriptions. Is this also varied? Cloud marked, black, silver. So dark, shiny, and kind of in the middle, in between them. What about the texture, the featheriness, and the looseness? Again, are we dealing with the idea there are all types in the world? And does that come back to the idea of Kamikaze as a social event, a social situation where we have a society telling you what to do, a society that isn't seeing the difference between people? Maybe that's part of the point of the power society has, or maybe it's the point, the power of the individual, that he acted against it, because there are all different types. Finally, we get this strange one, the Dark Prince, muscular, dangerous with the tuna. It is a really, really strange image, there's no doubt about that. Tuna are very, very big, must be difficult for a small boat to catch. So are we talking about the ability to handle challenges? Maybe. So we move back into italics, except for the last two lines. So again, we'll come back to that in a minute. The story of when he comes back and what happens. Now, it's mostly factual here. A few things to notice. Mostly to do with the children, the situation of the children, the contrast that's drawn between those two lines. And it's, again, very interesting that there's a deliberate stanza break being brought in here. I know there are 6-line stanzas, but it's been constructed that way. So it breaks in the middle. The children are still chattering and laughing, stanza break, till they learn to be silent, as though there's a kind of a break in the kind of natural way they are. As it says at the side there, society forcing the children to adjust their natural behaviour. So it's unnatural that this happened, quite possibly. And the repetition of no longer as well at the time. He no longer existed. He did once, he's not anymore. He was the father we loved, he no longer is. That this action has changed his identity as a human. It has that level of power. And of course then the final line, that final idea. He must have wondered which had been the better way to die. Again, must have, just as early on, still a speculation. Which had been the better way to die? Having emphasised the change with no longer, are we just coming back to this idea of a living death? That's where the no longer repetition takes us. Okay, so that stanzas. Let's then go back to this idea I've alluded to a few times of the form and the layout. Hugely significant here. Okay, first of all, we come back to this, that it appears to be the pilot's story, but if you look closer, it's actually the daughter's made-up story of what happened. I think that's very, very significant, very important, because it does change the whole point. Rather than talking about what really happened to a pilot, it talks about the effect on the people left behind. That's the focus. Rather than the pilot, it becomes a focus on the daughter. Now, the writing does mimic the pattern of a memory being retold. Remember, it's drifting rhythm, it's lack of rhyme. So that's again largely being emphasised here. And not from me, but I've seen elsewhere that people suggest that even though obviously this is not a haiku, it's much longer than that, it's not written in haiku. The plain style of a lot of it does feel like a haiku, as though again the writing is imitating maybe a more positive idea of Japanese tradition. The stanzas are equal in length though, and one interpretation of that is that that's suggesting that the daughter is imposing some kind of organisation on her story. They do flow on into each other, but it's a possible way of looking at it. But here's a very interesting one. The poem is actually only 3 sentences. Now, that's not something you necessarily notice to begin with unless you attempt to read it in one breath. But it really is. The first sentence, beginning her father embarked at sunrise, only finishes with the Dark Prince, muscular, dangerous. So the whole of those first 5 stanzas are one sentence, the memory itself. The second sentence is the italic section. the impact when he returns back, and then the third sentence is the final couplet. And therefore that seems to set it out very, very clearly into three single equal moments and events to contrast and gather with each other. The memory, the invented story, whatever you like to call it, the consequence, and the final thought and reflection. Now back to this thing of the italics that I've mentioned a few times. If you look at the italics lines, they are the reality. They're the truth of what happened. It was grandfather's boat. When he came back, his mother never did speak again in his presence, etc., etc. If you then look at the stuff that isn't in italics, that's the story. That's the invented stuff. Now, there is a contrast in tone in the italic sections. We talked about it. It's quite plain, it's quite straightforward, the truth. Whereas the rest of the poem is quite poetic, again, an invented story. And we come to a second, this idea of the power of storytelling particularly. But what I would highlight to you here as well, if you're comfortable looking at this in this way, this Dutch depth, if you were told that this is the way the poem is set up, that this is what it is, and there is this story and it's an invented memory, and then you get the reality, and therefore they do one bit in italics and one bit not, you would think that the story would be in italics, because italics seems to us to come with something, you know, added in, emphasised, whatever. But it's done the other way around. And I wonder if there's something deliberate in that as well. That again brings us back to the fact that the italics may be the truth, but may actually not be the important thing. Maybe someone's life, the reality of someone's life, isn't what's important, but the impact it has on other people. Maybe that's what we're looking at. Finally, we've got that final couplet, which puts across her conclusion. As we said, there is still the daughter speculating, but I would always come back to that idea. Sometimes he must have wondered which had been the better way to die. Okay, so let's take this back to the big ideas. Here we're going to do it through a questions this time that I think are worth considering. First of all, just generally think to yourself the impact of war and conflict on this individual. Now, when I say the individual, you can take either. You can have on the pilot, on the pilot's life, because even if this isn't what happened to him, he did come back, okay? Even if he came back for, well, what's most likely, that he just literally was a bit scared, war and conflict still had that huge impact on him. But then you can see the impact on the family and on the daughter particularly, the idea that she would feel the need to create a story like this. Ask yourself whether you have sympathy for the pilot, either in the story that's given here or in general. And if so, why? Is this to do with the way that we look back? Is it to do with our views of Japan and Japanese society? Is it to do with the things in the first stanza? And again, is this what really happened? If not, what did? Are we being challenged to think about that for ourselves? Because the daughter has a vested interest in it being something about family and something that gives him at least some credit. Maybe we don't. Maybe we have a different vested interest in looking at why somebody did this. Particularly it being on the other side of the war from most of us. Think again about the big idea of beauty and danger, and that idea of the two sides. The beauty of nature, the beauty of life, and the danger of nature as well as life. And seeing the relationship between the two. And think about where the power lies in the poem. Or, more to the point, who does the power lie with in the poem? See, we've got the power of society here. There's no doubt about it. The power of a society, a feudal, almost certainly totalitarian society as Imperial Japan was at the time. We are having it suggested to us, remember this is fiction, having it suggested to us that they used maybe quite nefarious techniques to get people to do unspeakable things for them, from that opening bit there. So there's an element of that there. The power of the pilot, the power of the individual, that even within those structures, the individual can still choose to do what they want. There'll be consequences, but they still do have the power to choose what they want to do. And then that final question suggests, are the consequences something that maybe should make us think about how to use the power we've got? And then, of course, there's the power of the daughter, and particularly the power of storytelling. And that's a very interesting response I think you can use this poem for. The idea that when you first read this poem, you just think this is what's happened to him. Many people still do. Many people just take it as read. This is what happened to the pilot. It's only seeing it closely looking closely that we see that this is an invented story. Is that once again highlighting that idea that stories have a huge power, because we tend to believe them, we tend to take them as truth, especially if the details are there and it's a good story. Finally, ask yourself that last question. What had been a better way to die? Maybe that is the final solution for us.